And hello again, boys and girls. Welcome back to the channel. It's of course your host Marley Startled, and today we're going to do something a bit different for Victoria 3. So what I found out once I was streaming slash recording Victoria 3 is that for the most part it is rather boring. There's a lot of time spent with me just building up my military or civilian industry, and in consequence, not really anything that's going to get that heart pounding. So, what I think I'm going to do now is after action reports. So, I intend to play each nation to their conclusion or close to the conclusion, and then discuss each nation, its pros and cons, and what I found was interesting about the systems and what I quite liked about it. So, of course, the first nation we'll talk about is Great Britain, and as you can see, we did rather well. Now, Great Britain is a very interesting nation because it demonstrates more the economic systems of the customs unions and the markets and the economy. I was very impressed with how the economy functions as a large nation. As a minor nation such as Scandinavia or Sicily, sometimes I had difficulty understanding why I was losing money or why I couldn't make profit within customs unions. And it's because if we look at actually Great Britain, they have an extremely large amount of natural resources. They've got lots of coal, lots of iron, and enough logging camps in the early game to set themselves up as an exporter. This, of course, means that if you try and play as a minor like Canada or, say, South Africa, if you try and build a basic raw industry, your prices will just be depreciated, and in consequence, you will just not make a profit because Great Britain will be producing most of the raw resources. So what I found with playing with Great Britain is that actually for some miners it's better to specialize, because when I was playing Great Britain I found out although I focused mainly on coal, iron, wood if I could get it, and tools until I could develop enough research to increase my surplus iron, I couldn't really focus on clothing, grain, or even clothing. And so what it meant is that for a minor nation who was within my customs union, if they met that sort of hole in my economy, then of course they could grow while I could provide the base resources. And so most of the game as Great Britain is you start off at extremely good position. You're already a great power. You have extremely good laws which give you proportional taxation. You can start colonialism immediately. So you've got initially per capita taxation, and you have a lot of laws and institutions already in place to let you expand. The You also have access to a large amount of resources and a very large existing customs union, meaning that you're going to have always potential access to rare resources or potential other nations collecting and receiving and providing your goods. Now, what I also found in Great Britain is that it has a few challenges. One of the challenges is that it hasn't really got any geographical areas to expand, whereas France, on the other hand, of course, can move into Spain or can move into Germany. Britain doesn't really shouldn't be doing that. But also France is becoming a up and comer with a massive economy which really does boost over time, and Austria is also quite a dangerous fiend to deal with. And so most of the game was trying to outpace the French economy to remain top dog. And to do this, I spent most of the time colonializing and investing massively in colonial institutions. Now, one thing I think a lot of players are dropping the ball on is the fact that colonialism is almost necessary for even smaller nations because they give you access to some very rare resources. Dye for your furniture or for your clothing, tea for your luxury products, sugar for your luxury products. I mean, there are some places with coal and iron, so if you've got a coal and iron deficit, the odds are you probably should have been doing the colonial rat race. I mean, the amount of resources you can get in Africa to keep your nation afloat is downright insanity. Like rubber for the late game. It was really, if you're struggling as saying as to Sicily as you're struggling as Sweden, then I highly recommend you rush down colonialism as quickly as possible. Africa is no longer just painting the map. It is actually very important to the mid to late game when, of course, resource changes occur, and then you suddenly get access to rubber and lead and so on and so forth, and your demands to get higher and higher. And so part of my playthrough as Great Britain was really focusing on expansion into Africa so I could get more rubber reserves, so I could get more luxury goods, so I could keep feeding the market. And as you can see, I did a very good job at expanding. And now I just did really most of the UK game. It was just a case of expanding into these areas, waiting for the sort of the tick to go over, so I'd go to war with the native population. And of course, I was very impressed with how the French AI was almost able to beat me early on with GDP growth. So initially, even when I was doing mass industry and really doing basic goods such as iron, coal, and tools, then of course it meant that sometimes France almost overtook me. So from really 1835 to 18 sort of well, 1836 to about I would say 1880, the AI France was almost overtaking me, and I was very much scraping my GDP. I don't know why that is, but this meant that I had to get involved in some wars to prevent France's expansion. So I went to war to prevent France expanding into Algeria, and I went to war several times to stop them expanding in Europe as well. And of course, that meant that sort of reduced their markets. Now, when I say about how you should really play a large nation as well to sort of understand what you should be doing as a smaller nation with your economies and your customs union, I found that with Great Britain, the larger you got, the more markets you needed, and of course, a lot of people are slagging off the economic system right now by saying that the AI is um, that the economic system is too simplistic. But because of how circular it is, you've got to if by producing one thing, you need to produce another. And so very often I was struggling to sort of round the circle and having to rely on a foreign or trade within the customs union. So such as for clothing and for wood. Even now, clothing is still pretty above deficit. And wood, of course. And this meant for minor nations such as Canada, who produce a lot of wood, yeah, 10 out of 23, their GDP just kept going up because, of course, they provided that necessary good for my economy, which I was desperately in need of. And so, by playing the larger nation of Great Britain, I was able to greater understand the importance of or how the economic system functions for smaller nations. For smaller nations, you shouldn't really be focusing on producing the base products in the customs union, but more the specialist goods, the luxury goods, the clothing, the steel potentially, and relying on the export of it from from your main provider, which is of course going to be the UK. Now, interestingly, as the game went on, I liked how the economic system changed. Initially, my economic expansion was in order to increase the demand of supplies and resources. So initially, it was to get more coal, more wood, more tools, more iron, more dyes, more luxury goods, so I could actually continue to grow my economy. Because after a certain point, if you can see here, it does begin to taper off around the 1870 point, because of course you're producing all these goods, but eventually you running out of the resources to build any more. And so once that occurred, it was really a necessity to continue expanding into Africa. Another point I found out was that with the economic system as to boot, oh, let me just go over to it. That does in fact have recessions coded in, which well, not coded in, but like the game does simulate recessions. You see this little dip here, that was a little recession in my growth, and that doesn't look so big on the grander scheme of things, but it literally did cripple my economy because I was having to spend less on my army, welfare subsidies. I had to spend less on my navy, and I had to stop subsidizing a lot of my industries because I was producing so many goods, no one was buying them. Like none of the rest of Europe was buying them. None of the rest of Canada or my custom union was buying them. And this meant that the game changed for Great Britain, or changed for me, in that I had to aggressively expand my markets. Not because I needed access to resources anymore, apart from really Mexico, because of the oil. It was now because I needed people to buy my goods, and the rest of Europe was becoming so developed that they weren't buying as much as possible. So in doing so, I eventually expanded into the United States, whose unfortunate GDP is just all over the place. Now, I think by expanding into the United States and America and Mexico, I was able to understand why the United States never forms. And it's because of this line here. Effectively, fighting along this frontier is extremely expensive. And what I found after like several failed attempts to push into Mexico was the fact that you lost so much money in war wages that often the loss ticker ticked up so high that you would automatically lose. And so I think the reason why the United States of America is not expanding into Mexico very well is because it's just losing by war ticker because the cost of fighting over the north of Mexico is too expensive. But regardless, that was just a very interesting thing I found. I also found that for the smaller states like the Confederate States and the Communist Confederate States of America, that one province versus one province civil wars don't work because there's not enough troops on either side to make the definitive blow, or they just don't have any troops. So this has been going on for well, since like 1870. And so by expanding this late into the game, I was able to understand the issues with the war mechanics. Another issue with the war mechanic was the fact I'm stuck in a forever war with Belgium. So I can't. I'm trying to land on do a naval invasion of Belgium, but it's got like 240 troops in its territory. Now the thing is, it can't beat me because its troops are worse, but it can beat me when defending a naval invasion. And because I can't put any large amounts of troops in to land, I'm sort of stuck trying to constantly push. I suspect if I tried hard enough and built enough troops, I could land eventually. But as it stands, the war ticker has stayed at zero for like 30 years, and the Belgians will not surrender, which I find very amusing. In any case, what I found really interesting about the economic system was not just the fact of expanding your markets in order to get hold of resources to continue construction. It was about expanding resources to actually make a profit of your construction and force other nations into your market. And Great Britain is interesting because you start off providing the basic tools and it's rapidly throwing out coal and iron and steel, all that wonderful stuff. But as the game goes on, you end up trying to have to change the way you play to remain economically competitive, and that is done by aggressive expansion into other foreign markets. And so eventually I was to move in and force the USA into a customs union, which was not very difficult because it did not industrialize very well. And it led to, of course, the economic collapse early on. And then, of course, it's been pretty stale ever since. I suspect because what I found is that when you're a larger, more industrial major or a larger nation, and you force another nation into your customs union, you drown their markets in your goods. And so I suspect by forcing them into my union, that I effectively killed the United States by forcing all my sort of surplus goods on the poor old United States, and they just could not produce a market enough they couldn't find a place within my market. All of these were dominions. I didn't want to puppet them as well. The same with Mexico, but Mexico did a little bit better on its GDP because of its demand for oil. And so Mexico, because it had a specialist resource and was able to build up that resource as opposed to the United States, actually went up in terms of its value and has been increasing ever since. Because although it's getting sort of drowned in my goods, because it has a specialist resource, it has done extremely well in providing a niche service for my customs union. So it's really, as Great Britain, by looking at the damage you're doing to other nations' GDP within your customs union, you can greater understand how it works and understands what you need to do as a miner in a customs union. And of course, Canada did well because it provided lots of logs. Mexico did well because it provided a lot of oil. The United States did not do very well because it provided basic goods, which I already made a surplus of. Colombia was a short expansion, and that was to secure the Panama Canal. But you can see when I did expand, the economy almost trebled overnight. Again, I suspect because of the access to all these goods, whereas before I suspect the standard of living was extremely poor. It then just rockets up simply because it's now getting a lot of easy and cheap surplus goods. The same was for Peru and Bolivia. And I found it very interesting or quite fun. Maybe it's just me, but I enjoyed watching other nations' GDP react to my market and react to the surplus goods. And I found it really interesting. Like initially, I came across the Japanese shogunate, and of course, it was still isolationist. Then by forcing it into my dominion, I forced it into the customs union, and you can just see where it economically exploded when all this cheap iron, all this cheap tools, all that cheap wood just flooded the Japanese market. And I found that really interesting, just the impact the economies can have. But I just found also what was great about Great Britain was the changing in aims. So the initial aim was, of course, providing that surplus basic raw resources for the rest of the customs union. And then it changed to making more specialized goods such as steel and locomotives. And then, of course, it changed to aggressively expanding my markets just so people would buy stuff. It was a very, really fun game because although you are top dog, it just highlights all the economic system has to offer in terms of supply and demand. And I found that really, really fascinating. Of course, my expansion eventually did lead to some issues, being that now everyone hates me. But because I was able to get so wealthy, I was able to like constantly upgrade my navy and constantly upgrade my army. So even though my army was smaller and my navy was smaller, this was not be possible to beat it in the open seas. With France being unable to muster a large enough fleet to even attempt to do so. Of course, when the game eventually came to the end, I did notice some minor issues, like some nations, such as the British Raj, never confederated, and their economy has been paling for pretty much ever. I suspect because of the surplus goods I'm providing, I don't think they're going to provide anything of use to me. Yeah, they provide all the stuff I already have in Africa, which is very interesting. So if you're potentially playing as India, or you're potentially playing as a minor nation, or playing a multiplayer game, you may actually not want to have expand too much into Africa, simply because you will starve India of a lot of its goods. So, of course, India seems like a large economy based on luxury goods, dye, tobacco, and of course, if you're getting it from Africa, then all you're doing is depressing the value of of India's goods. And so, again, you can see the impact what my economic decisions were having. And I think a lot of players just don't seem to understand what impact the economic systems are having, and so they think it's very basic. But really, it's very fascinating the fact that because when you stop and actually look and dig into why certain nations have ended up the way they have, it was fascinating to see that because I built up my own dye works and my own basic luxury industry in Africa, it depressed the value of the other resources of the customs union. And because India produced such like basic luxury goods and didn't provide anything of greater value, I mean, it provided some tools and an arms industry, but nothing really enough to do it better to find a niche in the customs union. The value of its goods depressed, and of course the standard of living declined. And I found that really fascinating. That how some nations are miners who don't have access to a lot of resources can really explode by specializing or providing a surplus and a rare good. Other nations that do have their products submerged in the customs union and do decline, and that was, I think, like the economic system is not simplistic. Like, everyone is complaining about it, but by playing this nation and understanding on a lot, I think it was easy to play as Greater Britain because, of course, you have so many build slots and you're building so much that you can actually visibly see the impact your actions are having on the global economy. Whereas, as say a minor nation such as Scandinavia or Sicily, you don't really understand what's going on because you don't really make a dent on the global economy. But to say this system is simplistic is unfair. It's just unfair to the developers. I mean, just the way the system works in terms of supply and demand and surplus goods, and having to make a decision on where you stand in the market, and being having your market forced open and being forced into a custom market and having it depreciate your goods. Like, I can understand why people would be upset about the military system. It is still a bit buggy. I understand why some people have had issues with the diplomatic system. But to say the economic system is bare bones and basic is just unfair, because you can't. What other game simulates surplus goods depreciating a market? What other game simulates a specialized industry that's dependent on foreign powers for basic resources? What other game simulates the expansion of Russia into Africa to get hold of those last bits of important strategic resources? Like, what other game simulates a recession because no one is buying your goods because your prices have depreciated? What other game simulates like financial like having to slash your government subsidies and slash your government institutions because of that recession? I mean, people will immediately jump to say Victoria 2, But Victoria too, economically, is not like it has a lot of complex systems behind it, but you can ignore them. Because anyone forget how you just max subsidies and then lower the wage? Like every strategy for every nation is max tariffs, reduce cost for capitalists and capitalists, so they build more factories. Like that is pretty much make sure you subsidize every single factory regardless of cost. Like how is that? Like the Victoria II economic system was complex, but it wasn't challenging. The player did not have to react to the market, whereas I had to react to the market. I had to react to how my nation's economic demands were changing. In Victoria too, I don't. I simply turn on subsidies for every nation, whack down capitalist taxes, whack up taxes everywhere, and whack up tariffs, and that was that. I mean, come on now, guys. Like how, like just by looking at Great Britain, you can just see the extent of the economic system just personified. And anyway, eventually it led to a state where I became massively ostracized, but I didn't care because, as for other nations such as France, you can't really see their GDP hit the wall. But what happened by expanding my market so aggressively is that everyone else's market began to decline. And if they refused to trade with me, it meant they couldn't get access to basic or luxury goods. And so eventually, because they had no one else to trade to really in their own markets, that economically they couldn't really do a very good job. I also still see the tragic oversight of Germany, where it never ever forms a an actual forms Germany because of the AI and the way the system works, which I found was very disappointing. But hey, how it is what it is. But I also found it very fascinating, and of course, and everyone is in this sort of the same boat. You're constantly having to expand your goods and expansion and quality of life, and if you don't, then what eventually happens is turmoil and rebellion. And because every other nation towards the late game couldn't find any more markets or couldn't trade for those luxury resources to meet the demand of their own domestic supply anymore, they eventually turned into civil war, which of course you can see in Occitania and you can see in Austria. And it really just comes down to the economy because, of course, when you see drops like this, you don't think anything of it in most of the time as a player. But when you experience even a small recession yourself, you realize how much of an impact this has on your national stability. And this, of course, led to massive turmoil, massive unemployment, and eventually revolution in Hungary and Slovakia. Same with France as well, but again, you don't see that because, of course, France has completely collapsed at that stage, and it starts in 1915. And even Germany had some minor issues, but where it's had a sort of stagnating economy. And at a certain stage, like it was close with France for a while, but eventually after a certain stage, I was just completely able to overtake because I had such a world economic dominance. Like I had more or less become the free trade system in Victoria too, where I had so many nations in my customs union that they were all freely trading. Um, but so what we'll talk about Great Britain again, about what Great Britain was like and what the aims were, like what you should be aiming for. So Great Britain was really just about staying on the top and making sure expanding your markets and expanding the basic resources to allow your customs union friends to buy in and continue their own growth, providing you the goods you need. And so a lot of it was early on increasing construction to about 245, building a lot of iron, rubber, and no, iron, coal, and steel, and then iron, coal, and wood, and then building as much tools as possible to feed the other minor nations. And then, of course, after a certain period of time, you then expand into specialist goods such as steel, locomotives, steamers, and then, of course, and it did mean that I wasn't in a deficit for clothing and a deficit for furniture, but other nations would hopefully fill that void, or worst case scenario, I could trade externally. So, altogether, Great Britain is a very fun nation, and I think it really does demonstrate all the economic system has to offer with supply, demand, recessions, and with like worker strikes and all that sort of stuff. You can actually feel your economy start to stutter or shudder over the weight over the competing sort of demands. Um, but now we'll actually take a look at my nation, and we'll talk about um, talk about sort of different aspects like the economy and the culture and so on and so forth and the laws. So we can see here we have glorious Great Britain, and one thing I really did like is how the larger you expand your towns, the greater they appear on the map. So you can see here, London has become this massive, sprawling, like it is in real life. Like really, London is almost like this in terms of like size. It is a sprawling mass. It's expanding everywhere, and everywhere on the map, apart from perhaps the smaller areas in the north, almost realistically sort of presents to me like just like the urban sprawl of a modern industrialized state, and I absolutely love it. I love the fact that I can scroll in and see the extent of my national growth. I mean, it is a beautiful, beautiful thing. And then, of course, other nations don't have that to the same effect. Like, and of course, in Russia, you can see like it's still even very barely industrialized. Yeah, so you can see a rather large industrial complex over here, but apart from that, you've got smaller towns and outposts, which is getting pretty interesting. And of course, when we go down to Africa, we are starting to see a development of our industry and our mines and our coal and that, but nothing too excessive. It's not to the same level um, as the rest of Europe, simply because I'm only using that to get resources. Oh, I got any nations in turmoil? No, I haven't. Then, of course, our national laws began to change simply because we were making such a profit. You can see here, that is when I go to, well, stat is when I go to per capita taxation. So I think I found while playing in Great Britain was that after your pops change and the nature of your country changes, all the legal systems are become redundant. So initially I was on per capita taxation, and initially it was a good tax to have at the time. But as the game went on, I was in fact making massive losses, and you can see like the 1.12 million difference in taxable income because of a different taxation is insanity. So I think another mistake I was making as a player was just keeping my taxation stagnant over in one particular area. And once I moved and upgraded my taxation to reflect my new economy and my new demographic system, or my new demographics, I started to make a ton of money, which is really, really interesting. And of course, I started to become much more liberal. So eventually, I had regulatory bodies. I ended child labor, and because I had so much money for my trade, I was able to become a very liberalized nation. Public schools, public health, guaranteed liberties, and this just meant that my standard of living constantly increased, my levels of radicals constantly decreased, and so on and so forth. And so to the point where I pretty much don't have any more radicals. Of course, I had to invest in those areas as well to make sure everyone was employed. But simply put, I just did not have any more radicals because of the extent of my growth and the liberal policies, which were backed up by, of course, paying for it via my taxation. And of course, my government itself was fairly happy. And one thing I again really overlooked is these little boons these each party gives you. Like some of these boons are absolutely amazing, and if you can keep each party happy, if you can afford it, I would highly recommend you do so. Like plus 20% workforce ratio is amazing. Uh, Loan interest not so good. Capitalist investment pool not so good. But also, if you do piss them off, you can make massive penalties like plus 50% military goods costs. This can alone financially cripple you. And so, actually balancing to make sure everyone was loyal was very important for some parties, because if you didn't, then it could financially destroy you. Of course, for each different nation, they will have their own penalties and bonuses, which with all their sort of varying extents. But for the most part, it was quite interesting having to balance my laws around making and my taxation and that to keep everyone happy. Of course, literacy stayed low. Quality standard of living, of course, stayed extremely well. Exploded after a certain period of time because they had such access to such cheap goods. This in turn led to massive population increase. So my population is the third largest in the world, and radicals started to decline. while the number of loyalists started to just radically improve to ridiculous levels. Um, what else? So if you look at our great powers, you can see North Germany, they've got a population of 220. Oh, let's take a look at population. So the largest population is Greater Qing. I was never going to beat that. The British Raj was a pretty large population, and of course Great Britain, with everyone else behind. And I think it was because I starved them of markets, because I was able to expand my own market so aggressively, and I either stopped really trading with me unless it had to. They just collapsed economically because of the nature of the game. You can say this isn't a map painter, but after a certain stage, once you get to once your custom union gets to a certain stage, the game does become a map painter because you're just so economically strong compared to the rest of the world, because you get such an access to resources. And Great Britain is probably one of the few nations where you can map paint, because of that ability to expand so rapidly. Then, of course, you had France, and then you had Russia. Then, of course, if we look at prestige, my prestige has trebled because at the end of the day, I was making so much prestige from simply being so large. I couldn't be kept up. I couldn't be kept up. And standard of living, apart from a few minor nations in the middle of nowhere like the Ionian Islands, uh, I was had extremely good standard of living. And of course, the reason I had such extremely good standard of living is because I had access to surplus goods of grain and basic basic industry from the other minor nations. So custom units are a wonderful way to improve your standard of living. Of course, the budget. I'm not. I could probably reduce taxation, but I left it around about here. Initially, I did reduce taxation down to very low taxes, and I was able to do that for a while. You can see that during my recession, I had to rely on a lot of consumption taxes to increase my income, and because it doesn't automatically go away, I've kept I've kept all of these on there, so I was able to keep my income alive, and I'm making 170, 190, 220, 280, 500k services. I'm making 1.72 million on basically value added tax, which is really, really good. Probably an oversight from the developers. Perhaps this needs to have a greater penalty because I could pretty much ignore the penalty to my authority by simply doing but by simply not turning off any of these policies. Of course, because of the wages, I was able to whack up military wages and whack up government wages, and so I could just afford everything. And the states providing the best wages was, of course, wow, Tianyan was actually providing the best wages. That's pretty interesting. And then British West Australia and British North Africa. And the most expenses, wages 20 and expenses 730, and the largest taxes were provided by the Midlands and Yorkshire, which is very interesting. That's really quite interesting. I didn't even notice that. And the assets, so my principal could go as high as 280 million. So I don't think I was ever worrying about that because I was just outrunning my debt with constant growth. Then for my industries, you can see first with the rural, I really built up. Like I had 528 coal, 287 iron. Where's my logging camps? 3,000. Like, is that what was that? 337. 307 logging camps. And that was to provide the base resources to make my tools, which is 499. Even then, I was losing tools and I was having to import tools because I just wasn't producing enough. Which is again very interesting. Like my early economy was entirely based on that. Of course, by the late game, I was able to fill the holes in the clothing and the furniture industry to an extent, but because my population was constantly going up, this is still a bit of a deficit. But early game, the main focus was on that industry, followed by locomotives and steel, and then steamers and so on and so forth. But the main focus was really just really driving down the supply of wood and tools. Of course, our railway system had to get larger and larger as our population increased, and our urban economy, because really this is late games, it's very hard to demonstrate what the early game economy was. But late game, I was able to fill holes in my supply chain via mass production of paper mills, chemical plants, and textile mills and furniture, which before then I was having a massive issue trying to meet my demands for. Now, of course, if we look at our trade system, we can see again our services, like older prices for most of our surplus goods. Even now, I'm still struggling to meet demand for clothing. I mean, it's not too bad, but it's still a bit of an issue. Same with a little bit, well, pretty much the same for electricity. I'm not meeting demands, and oil is still very high in demand. I had to sacrifice some of my industry not to use oil, simply because I couldn't get enough oil out of the ground. And hardwood, you can still see I'm still in a massive demand for wood. So if you want to make if you're a mining nation with a lot of wood, then just build a lot of wood, because you'll always need it, especially hardwood. Like I was making so much hardwood, but I just could not meet demand. So even at this stage, like larger nations, like a smaller nation, still can find a niche, but you can start seeing that the value of some of my goods are becoming massively depressed, and so I had to expand aggressively to sort of meet that market demand, or find new buyers. Of course, with luxury goods, there wasn't any particular issues apart from some issues with radios, which I was able to fix mostly, and I was able to import a lot of, say, clothing and furniture. And this, of course, then had a positive impact on my actual prices, being that demand wasn't the cost for my pops to buy wasn't as large. But still, you could still make a bit of a niche profit here if you're a minor nation, just building up luxury factories and basic goods, such like lead is also very important if you can get hold of that. So even then, furniture and luxury goods, luxury clothes was still pretty high demand in my nation. And at this point, I just become a mass exporter of goods. So France became was a massive importer of it. It came to the point that every war people had was economically destructive, because I was had such a had such a grip on most of the world. Again, people were mass buying coal, mass buying, and because I had protectionist laws, this meant I was making a massive profit on this as well. Because yeah, it's just a very interesting, very fun system of watching all this sort of economy at play. And the members, all the boys, all providing their with the GDP of Ontario being pretty close to being higher than a lot of my colonies. Eventually, I was able to take Cuba and so on as well. Actually, let's take a look at Cuba. What happened to Cuba economically? Yeah, as soon as I take Cuba about here, it just pops off. And then, of course, our military. Small armies, but extremely powerful armies because they had the best techs. Now, if we go to our development tab, so all of these were equipped with the best equipment I could get hold of. And it actually meant that sometimes I had to degrade the quality of my troops because of the cost of some of my goods. So early on during my recession, I had to change. I suspect my recession was caused by my army, but I had to change what level of soldier my guys were, simply because I didn't have the goods on the market to afford the next upgrade. And I think a big mistake a lot of players are making are they moving to upgrade their units without having the supplies to feed it. So that's also a point I found out. But the military wasn't anything special. It was just a lot of battleships and carriers and stuff like that towards a late game. Yeah, because I could afford it. Simply put, because I could afford it. Of course, I could release subjects if I wanted to. And that's what I found as well. I didn't want to actually take territory in these nations. I wanted to force them into my market. I didn't actually want to expand. I just wanted more people in my market. So I expanded economically, which is interesting. You don't just like take territory. You force dominion status. Technology, pretty much everything was researched. Nothing to look here, but cultures is interesting. Let's take a look at the English culture. The obsession was with tea and with coffee, so of course they were willing to pay higher prices. Let's see if I can bring up the culture for the Qing. No, I can't. That's a shame. Shame. Oh well. But you can see my obsession was tea and coffee. The Scottish had an obsession with luxury clothes, meat, and opium. Of course, these came and went as sort of the game progressed. But you can see it had Dixie, who had a lovely desire for liquor, and so because my nation became so diverse, there was almost a demand for every single good because I had just so many different pops with all different wants and needs, which is really really interesting. Like I liked how like almost everything was growing because every culture at least wanted something. And of course our pops. This is what I'm talking about. Sort of eventually you get to deflation, where the value of things became less expensive simply because there's too much of it. And as you can see, like they were meeting well, like it was like it's quite an achievement to get the pay an average of plus 1.4%. To make the plebs pay less than minus 0.2% is actually paying cheaper for goods is an achievement to make in this game because it's actually very difficult to do. And I very much found that very impressive, and I really enjoyed improving the standard of living via the economic consequences of my actions. And of course, as our nation and dominion got larger and we became a free immigrant and multicultural society, our immigration increased and our population changed. So we ended up with mostly 50% of the empire being British English, and then of course 8% being Yankee, 7% being Scottish, a load of Irish, 86 million, and Dixie at 70 million, followed by Australian, Misery, which I don't know who they are or where they're from. Oh, from Arabia, okay. That's probably because from Egypt. Bantu, Mandi, Brazilian, Welsh. So we have a bit of a hodgepodge, but our big ones are Scotland, Ireland, Yankee, and a little bit of Dixie. Now this does not really give you the whole pie. So it's best to click on the building and to see what populations are made up with. So you can see here, English is the primary culture in England, well, in London. And then if you move north, Filipino is a large proportion. Like it's more amusing to watch. Now, rather oddly, if we go over here, about 30% of the population in Africa and some African provinces are Dixie, which is a tad confusing. Anglo-Canadian and Quasian, which is a tad odd. Which is so going through the different pops and that, it can be very funny to see where different populations have moved. Of course, different populations, apart from having different cultural needs, aren't that big an issue in different places. You don't really have cultural conflict when you get the higher laws such as multiculturalism. But I just found that a really fascinating thing to see some cultures from across the world just come over and live in Africa, uh, which was really, really rather interesting. And the fact that a lot of my population became Yankee was also pretty interesting. I wonder if any English people moved over. No. These stayed very culturally homogenous simply because I suspect their laws in Egypt were quite, how do I put it, uh, basic. Yeah, racial segregation. So yeah, that's probably why they stayed culturally homogenous. And I think that was more or less it. I suppose you can take a look at the global GDP, which of course no one can compete with. And then we can go with markets. I suppose we'll take a look at the market again because we may be able to see what my market was mass producing and sending. So you can see here, we just follow all the little red bars. You can see we're pretty much exporting to the world. Go and click over on which market. I can't really tell which market that one's going to. I think red bar means export. The game's a bit spazzy right now. Go over here. Okay, let's actually take a look. So this guy's exporting grain to this guy. It's hard to tell. Let's add this early on, but I don't know if that mark is export or import. Oh no, okay, so we were importing from pretty much across the world as well, probably just to keep our economy going. But I don't, probably just to actually, just in the short term, keep our economy going. And then, of course, people were importing all our goods in terms of 30 locomotives. But if we take a look over here, who else is buying stuff? Clothing, iron, coal, iron, glass, clothing, glass, and so on and so forth. That's a very interesting system. Very interesting system. What were my imports actually? What were my trade agreements? It won't really tell me, but unless I go through each one manually. But yeah, I was buying some coal, which again I could have built up myself, but I just couldn't build at that stage because you're always going to have a deficit somewhere. But anyway, then of course we had our markets. So we take a look at our migration. You can see pretty much at this stage everyone is flocking to us. Like our population just keeps going up and up and up. And then if we take a look at our radicals, we can see a lot of radicals which is to be expected. You're always going to have radicals because of some unemployment or wages, and there's not much you can do about it. As long as they don't revolt or there's no turmoil, you're pretty good. And of course, the standard of living is extremely good in Britain. It's also pretty good in Canada. It's garbage in North in America, and in most of Great Britain as well. The standard of living in a lot of the African colonies are doing pretty well. Sadly, India collapsed because it could not meet the luxury demands for the customs union, which is again very interesting. I think that can be a very interesting game playing against India, especially in multiplayer games. And finally, I think that's about it. So I also played a short multiplayer game on Discord with some people. Again, the multiplayer was extremely buggy. There was a lot of desyncs and a lot of delays, and I think that's where really the game positively shines if you can get the multiplayer working. That is because it means that the economy, like you start really seeing the impacts your actions have on other players, because they can say, "Oh, look, I've got a lot of coal," or "Oh God, you're starving my economy," or "Can I buy this from you?" And I was playing as Great Britain, I found it was much harder to turtle because you were having to balance the power of Europe, and it was really fun having to be the referee of what was going on in Europe. So, in one case, Prussia was trying to colonize Australia, and I said, "Look, you're not going to colonize it. I'll just go to war with you once you're finished colonizing." Or at one stage they tried to take the Dutch East Indies. I was like, "Why are you in the colonies? Go away!" And in the end, I said, "Look, I'll bankroll you if you leave." And then in the end, he backed down. Unfortunately, he was one of those sort of players that does stupid things, and then if he doesn't get his way, he leaves the game. But he that's what he did. He didn't even form Germany, and he tried to go for the colonies. And then when I said no, because I'm not going to let Germany into my territory, he left the game. And then we had France, the French player, try and invade Spain, which I moved in on the side of Spain and kept him alive by bankrolling him. And France backed down from the diplomatic play because of my involvement. Of course, there was some issues in the Ottoman Empire with the collapse, and Austria, of course, Austria and Russia began cutting up the Ottoman Empire. But I left that alone because that was up to the really the other European powers to deal with: France, Spain, Prussia, and so on and so forth. And it can be really fun game of balancing the books. And there was a little rivalry between me and France as he tried to expand his markets and I tried to counter, and having to build up my navy and build up my army to make sure he didn't land or do anything silly. And because the stakes for war are less, like it's not going to be, because you can't add new war goals in a war, which I think is actually really good in multiplayer. It meant that the stakes were less, and so wars were less stressful and more forgiving. Unless, of course, that they put a load of war goals in at the start of the diplomatic play, which is very risky, because if they were to do that in a multiplayer game, you would just counter your own risky policies as well. And so it did meant there was sort of a concert of Europe. Of course, England had to sort of establish a bit of a concert, or I had to establish a bit of a concert. But for the most part, it was a very fun game of the give and take of, Spain, you should join me. France has tried to invade you. You should join my customs union. Or, France, don't you want to get involved in not in the in what's going on with the Ottoman Empire, because Russia's going to eat it. And there's just little things like that what made the game really fun and interesting. But in summary, Great Britain's a really fun nation to truly understand, because you're on such a macro level what your actions have and what impact your actions have on the economic model in the world. And it really just shows you as the game progresses how your economic needs can change from initially radically growing to meet demand to eventually having to force open and expand your markets to prevent recession and the reduction of growth, a reduction of value in your goods, crashing your economy. And it's just little things like that which I found absolutely really amazing as Great Britain. It's quite a boring nation if you're looking for expansion, but apart from expanding in Africa, it is you really are the balance of power in Europe, and it's really an economic game. And I would really for Great Britain. I would really recommend, before you really complain too much about the economic system, to first play a few minors, try and understand what's going on, and then play a major to understand why potentially your goods aren't making a profit. And the odds are it's probably because you're building stuff which is already on the market for pennies to the dollar. I really like it. Of course, I did see some of the big old bugs like the never-ending wars and so on and so forth. And I found Great Britain a really fun game. So Great Britain is all about the expansion of markets, providing basic goods or basic resources to your customs union, and eventually forcing open the door to other markets in the colonies and over in Asia and the Pacific. A really fun nation, and I highly recommend that you give definitely Great Britain a go, because it has each nation, which I found does have its different challenges, and Russia was very different very different to play with when compared to Great Britain. Anyway, that's all, gentlemen. I'll leave you all to it. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you all later. Adieu.